insisted that South Africa was a democratic country and insisted that we had an independent judiciary. They insisted that this was so despite the United Nations declaring apartheid to be a crime against humanity. Resistance to apartheid was met with brutality and an arsenal of laws that endowed the law enforcement agencies, including the security apparatus, with untrammeled powers. And in those dark days, much happened in the dark and unknown places, in police stations, in detention facilities, and elsewhere. And today, even 30 years into democracy, many families still seek to know the truth of what happened to their loved ones. And Mohammed, DP as he then was, remarked on this in the well-known case of Azapova's president when he said, and I quote, "Secrecy and authoritarianism have concealed the truth in little crevices of obscurity in our history. In other cases, that truth continues to emerge slowly and painfully as families seek closure and as we collectively seek to correctly record the history of truly what happened in this country. And the many inquests that have reopened have provided an opportunity for that precisely to happen. But what about the courts? For apartheid to survive for as long as it did, it just didn't need an array of laws, an effective police force and a security apparatus. It needed institutions that would enforce those laws and enforce them in accordance with what the Sovereign Parliament had decided. And those laws, you would know, covered virtually every aspect of our existence. They determined where we would be born, where we would live, where we would go to school with, where we would work, where we would study, who we would fall in love with, where we would die, and where we would be buried. It tracked us from the cradle to the grave. And for those laws to survive, and for that system to survive, it required a judiciary that was by and large willing to enforce those laws. And much has been said about the role of that judiciary, and much has been debated about it. But I can do no better than to reflect on the words of retired Justice Johan van der Westhuizen, who spoke about that judiciary in a speech which was since reduced to an article which appeared in the African Journal of Law and Human Rights. And this is what he said, and it's a short quote. He said, "Law was a tool in the hands of the apartheid regime. Many judges and lawyers," and I emphasize, I didn't say all, applied and practiced apartheid laws because they agreed with them, because they were so much part of the system that they never thought of questioning them, because they benefited from them, or because they overcame their discomfort with them by arguing that the law was the law, which was their task to accept and apply. The legal system's lack of legitimacy in the eyes of very many people reached crisis proportions. Anti-apartheid lawyers and accused persons used the courts as strategic sites of struggle and utilized the space created by court procedures to fight political battles, because no other forum or arena was available for lawful political activity. And so courts existed in a contested space. For government, it was there to demonstrate its power and authority over the people, and in particular those who sought to challenge its authority and its legitimacy. But by using the courts, government was also obliged to at least facially go through the motions of a fair trial. Even in doing so, this attempt at equal justice was rejected, and rejected for good reason, by many who saw themselves as being tried in an illegitimate court. In 1962, and in the old synagogue, just down the road from here, late President Mandela, facing a charge of leaving and entering South Africa illegally, applied for the recusal of the magistrate. The application was unsuccessful, of course, but this is in part what he argued. He said that it offended the elementary principles of justice to bring him before a court constituted by a system of government in which he and millions others played no part, and to have his case heard by those who were responsible for the establishment and maintenance of that very system in which they had a material interest and which excluded the majority. He asked the rhetorical question, and I quote, "What sort of justice is this that enables the aggrieved to sit in judgment over those against whom they have laid a charge? A judiciary controlled entirely by whites and enforcing laws enacted by a white parliament in which Africans have no representation, laws which in most cases are passed in the face of unanimous opposition from Africans," he asked. In doing so, he emphasized more than once that his recusal application was not a personal attack on the magistrate or prosecutor, and that it was the system that enabled this to happen that was the target of his ire. In the years that followed, and as resistance to apartheid strengthened, internally and externally, the state became even more uncompromising in its approach to those who resisted its policies. In the early 1980s, I worked in a law firm probably about 200 meters away from this court, and my work almost on a daily basis required me to enter this court building. I would come into Court C, this very court, and sit in the separate designated visitors gallery for black people, observing the proceedings. I watched in awe and fascination how some of the greatest legal minds argued their cases with passion and eloquence. I sat there inspired and moved by the courage of those who stood in the dock, but invariably left with a sense that the justice that was so necessary and so needed would not endure. It was for me an education in many different respects: a legal education, a political education, and an education in understanding what the idea of a shared humanity meant. And I would leave with mixed emotions, with a sense of despair at what was happening in my country, but with a sense of hope that there were men and women of courage and conviction who would continue the fight. And that inspired generations and millions of others. This court was also the very same court in which the state prosecuted leadership of the South African Students' Organization, Black People's Convention, for holding the pro-Frelimo rally in Curry's Fountains. It was the same court in which the Dalmas treason trial was heard. It was the same court in which the Reverend Cedric Mason was prosecuted. So in many respects, it was a court that came to represent the might of the apartheid state. And you would understand from what I've said that for millions of people there was distrust in the law because the law was seen as a tool of social destruction. There was mistrust in the institutions that were required to enforce the law because they were not institutions in which millions of people had the opportunity to participate. They were institutions designed to maintain and uphold a particular political system and a political ideology that sought to create a hierarchy of humanity in this country. So much has been said about the celebrated speech. It lasted about 3.5 hours, and much has been written about its strategic relevance, how in the time it took to deliver the speech, the court, the nation, the world at large was allowed, if they were willing to listen, to understand the genesis of the struggle of the African people in this country. That what they sought was simply to live a life of decency and dignity. The speech also captured the numerous attempts by those to seek a peaceful and negotiated solution to the problem that faced the African people in this country, and the rejection of those attempts. The speech also touched on what ultimately prompted the liberation movements to resort to the armed struggle, and how, in its conception, the armed struggle was about hitting economic installations, focusing on ensuring that there was no loss of life and no loss of civilian life. And so that was the hallmarks of the speech, but I recall three things of the speech that I think is important for today. One, the idea of leadership. And in his speech, former President Mandela spoke about the great leaders of this country, Moshoeshoe Sikanuni, Dingaan, and he said he also wanted the opportunity to serve his people. And today, that idea and that concept of leadership is critically important. Leadership is about serving one's people. And he was willing, and him and his fellow trialists were willing to pay the ultimate price in the service of those people. And it succeeded, I think, in demonstrating what the struggle was about. That it wasn't about one group of people wanting to replace oppression with another group of oppressors. It wasn't a struggle that was located in hatred or revenge, but a struggle that would recognize that even in our diversity, we shared a common humanity. The speech may never have been delivered had the objection of the Attorney General, Dr. Percy Yuta, at the time been upheld. Before the speech was delivered, and the speech was to be delivered at the opening of the defense case on the 21st of April, Dr. Yuta objected on the basis that that doesn't constitute evidence. The person making the speech will not be subject to cross-examination, but the objection was dismissed and the speech was proceeded with. And so it's regarded by many as an iconic speech. But interestingly, two people who assisted in what is called the polishing of the speech, Anthony Sampson, a journalist and a writer, and Nadine Gordimer, Nobel laureate, both friends of the late President Mandela, had assisted in, as I said, polishing the speech. And the two of them had different reactions to the speech. Anthony Sampson described it as the most effective speech of his career. That is the career of the late President Nelson Mandela. Whereas Nadine Gordimer, interestingly, said that she thought the delivery of the speech was hesitant, parsonical. I looked up this word parsonical, and it relates to a parson, so almost sermon-like. And then she went on to say, until only at the end did the man come through. And when he had spoken that last sentence, the strangest and most moving sound I have ever heard from human throats came from the black side of the court audience. And so that's just two reactions to the speech. And I think what we must recall is that when accused number one delivered the speech, he delivered it just not on his own behalf, but I think it would be fair to say that he delivered it on behalf of all his fellow trialists. And he probably spoke on behalf of millions of South Africans who never had a voice that day. And so courts were important then as they are important now. And today the court city still exists as a functioning court. Judge President, I think I saw a beautiful picture of you the other day. Was it in this court? With your red robes. And so, but it's a court in a different context. It's a court that must now serve a democratic society. And the demands that that places on courts and on judicial officers is enormous. It's enormous because we took a decision to create a new and different society, one distinctly different from the one that we hoped to leave behind. A society based on our respect for each other, on the understanding that even as we sit here in this historic place, and even in our diversity, we share a common humanity, that we are committed to a society underpinned by the rule of law and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. And courts that are vested with the judicial authority and that are required to discharge their functions without fear, favour or prejudice function in that context. And so let me just say a few words about some of the challenges that courts face, judicial officers and the system. And I do so in locating the context within which we function. 30 years into democracy, and on the back of what has been described as the most progressive constitution in the world, South Africa is still consistent to be the most unequal society in the world. Today, 25% of people probably will go to bed hungry. Probably 50% of people live in poverty. And one is compelled to ask, how does this happen in a society so unconditionally committed to equality? And that's a challenge we face, and that's a challenge we all face. It's not a challenge that just is faced by this democracy, the oldest democracy in the world and the largest democracy in the world. I refer to the United States of America and I refer to India, face equally